Hey everyone, this is James from TDB here. Today I am going to be talking about a seemingly very simple question and just trying to explore it in a little bit of greater depth. How do you know if a tea is good? And so this is something that was, I think, asked on a YouTube comment or an email. I'm sorry, I forget exactly where it was asked. But it got me thinking a little bit. It's seemingly a very, very simple question of how do you actually know if a tea is good, but I think you can sort of explore it into like greater depths of why exactly and what's going on exactly. So one example that came to mind immediately is something like grocery store pu'er, which is a very common thing you'll see on Reddit or on Discord, or someone that has just had their first experience with pu'er tea and it's from the grocery store. And the answer is that tea is probably not very good, but people are answering that question based off different context clues of like, yeah, this is grocery store pu'er. Usually you don't get good pu'er from grocery stores, rather than from something where they've actually tasted the tea and can say. So if you're actually able to taste this tea and say whether it's good or bad, how do you know if it's good? And the answer is that people are using their experience and they're using references of teas that they've tried in the past to know. So really, the answer is experience. What does that exactly mean? How applicable is it in all these times? And the other way that people can really tell if one tea is better than the other, or that sort of thing, or if they have a preference, or how teas will kind of differ in characteristics, is through comparison. Comparison both, it doesn't necessarily need to be side by side, but we're comparing teas. Like if you had one tea B, then you went to tea C, you'd automatically kind of in your palate be comparing B to C. So the quality and the descriptions about why a certain tea is good are going to, of course, differ category to category. Why you would say a Wui Oolong is good will most likely differ quite a bit from why you would say a ripe pu'er is good. Of course, there are going to be a lot of shared characteristics too. I mean, a lot of these teas are the same plant, so things like Kueh Gan could be applicable to several different tea categories, if not all of them. And so really when we are judging whether a tea is good, we're kind of using this reference of what tea experiences we have in the past and trying to judge if that tea is good or not based off of those. And so Marshall wrote a really interesting post recently. He is not a frequent poster these days, nor am I, for that matter. But it's on baseline tea, and I highly recommend people go check it out. Just about everything Marshall writes is worth reading. And he talks about how different places will have different baseline teas, and so that will impact how you judge certain things that you're presented with. And that makes a lot of sense. If your baseline tea, if the tea you're drinking every day is traditionally stored pu'er, as it is in Hong Kong, or for a lot of people in Hong Kong, your baseline is going to be very different from Japan. For me, at least, the Japanese drink a lot of green tea. For me, at least, whenever I go to Japan, I have been struck by how bitter most of their green tea really, really is. And that's because my baseline tea is definitely not the Japanese green tea. So my palate is really, really not used to those. Whereas if you're drinking that tea daily, you could come kind of numb to it. This is commonly observed, in my opinion, with the pu'er community. People really, really like to go deep in pu'er, myself included, and specifically raw rather than ripe usually. And raw can get very, very bitter, especially if one is trying to sample a lot of like young pu'er and things like that. So if your baseline becomes kind of numb enough and you have just built all of these fairly recent experiences, which are going to be more powerful than older experiences, then your baseline of what is bitter or not is going to be shifted dramatically. A tea that's not even particularly bitter to a pu'er drinker could be extremely bitter to someone else. Like an example is if I'm brewing like a 2004 Yongqing Hao Tuji, so a 20-year-old Iwu basically, that's not really very bitter as far as pu'er standards go, but I serve it to someone like my mom who never has pu'er. She's going to say this tea is bitter. I mean, this is an experience that I know my friend Garrett has actually had. But if I were to have that on my own versus like a young raw, of course the tea is not very bitter too. So a lot of it will depend on kind of these recent baseline teas as well, which is, in a way, a form of experience too. In my opinion, the easiest way to judge and to compare teas to is by side. Of course, this is not perfect, and you're going to lose certain characteristics that are going to be harder to pick up on. So, like if the aftertaste hits late or is delayed or something like that, if you're pounding teas side by side, it'll be hard to attribute which tea is providing which. So there are certainly things you're going to miss out on, but the obvious differences are going to be really, really emphasized in your head. So I do highly recommend side by side, especially when you are comparing similar teas. In fact, I'm going to actually be doing something a little different, but I'm going to be doing some comparison episodes that are very, very obvious comparisons. Because usually I will follow the template of sort of like similar teas. We want to see which one's better. We want to see how these teas are a little different. We're going to do like a 2004 Shagwan Tuji Tool versus 2005 Shagwan Tuji Tool. Which one has better base material, things like that. But in the end, they're very, very similar teas. But I want to compare teas that are very, very obviously different. And I'm not sure exactly how those episodes are going to go, but we will see. I'm a little curious just as an experiment, to try those out. So yeah, experience is definitely an important factor. Another thing is like, especially when you are brewing teas that your references are a little sparser. For instance, I'm going to have a much easier time judging a ripe pour because I'm drinking ripe pour daily. In fact, I have some right in front of me right now. Versus if I were to judge a 30-year-old dry stored pour from the 90s. And that's not to say I've never had 30-year-old dry stored pour. I have. I've had plenty of them. Well, not plenty of them. I've had probably dozens of them. I do remember those teas very well. In fact, I try very hard to remember those teas because the experiences are rare. But I'm going to have a lot harder time judging those teas versus a ripe because the experiences also will fade in time, and so it's going to be hard to compare. Like if I had the 88 Qingbing, it's going to be hard to compare that versus my memory from 4 or 5 years ago and be like, oh, okay, how's this one compared to Sue's 88 Qingbing? So yeah, repetitions and things like that are really helpful to reinforce. So if you're having a lot of this certain type of tea recently, that can be really, really helpful in terms of judging. So it's like someone just pounded 100 different young raw samples in the span of 2 or 3 months. Even if they are relatively new to tea, they might actually be a somewhat good judge of that category of tea at that specific moment in time. So yeah, the judgment can actually be okay. And that was one of the things I really aimed for in my kind of tea of the month comparisons I was doing early on in TDB, where I would just drink a ton of different samples kind of themed in a certain way. So 1 month I did Iwu Raw Pour. And that way, even though I wasn't experienced in the way that I'd had like a big memory bank of Iwu Raw Pour to draw back from 5 or 10 years, I was comparing these teas very closely with each other in kind of close succession. So it's like Friday I'm going to have this one, Saturday I'm going to have this one and this one, and Sunday I'm going to have these two. So it's like I'm having them in such close succession that the experiences and the comparisons are more obvious. And so the last thing I wanted to comment on too is experiences are also a really fickle thing. They're subject to memory and things like that, to all sorts of human things that are going to not be 100% accurate over time too. Another common thing I have seen a fair amount is someone that is chasing kind of an initial tea experience that was really, really mind-blowing and formative, but has very likely been diluted in their head. So as an example, if someone had tea 5 years ago, they're first introduced to raw pour, they had a very special tea, like let's say it's like a 2015 Guafeng Jai Iwu tea, something like that. So like, oh man, this is really, really good. And since then, they've basically been chasing that experience, trying to recreate it. But the problem is that experience in their head might not actually be very accurate, and so they're comparing actual real teas at that moment versus this thing that has become kind of floofy and a little bit elusive and is basically impossible to recreate. So this is something I've definitely seen before too, where people are just kind of chasing after this tea, which is really more of an experience that has been changed in their mind, especially when they're really, really fresh and they don't have that back data of experience to draw from. Something can really, really get shifted and changed a lot in people's mind. So that's the last thing I could do is like, it can be very difficult because you're chasing something that essentially was not exactly as it is in your memory. So it might have been a wonderful experience, but it's basically impossible to recreate in that same way. So yeah, in the end, I would say experience and comparison are really how you know a tea is good. How we would know a right pour tea from the grocery store is not good beyond the context clues is we would drink it, be like, okay, I've had 10 different right pours before. I know this is not good because compared to those teas, it stinks, it's nasty, it's thin, it doesn't do the things that those other teas do. And it's because we've tried tea in the past and we have those experiences that we can do that. So, if it's a really, really obvious example like that, you might not need a recent experience to do, but if it's, a little closer to the norm, you might need to drink a ripe pour and then be like, okay, this is what ripe should taste like. Okay, let's try this one. That's what that tastes like. Clearly, this ripe tea, like some Dai 7572, is much better than this rando grocery store ripe pour. Okay, so that sums up this episode. Let me know how you liked it. A little bit more of a musings episode. How do you know if the tea is good? And I will see y'all next time. Cheers.